The autumn of 2003 arrived in rural Montana with a crispness that bit at exposed skin and turned breath into visible clouds. In the small farming community of Whitlock, population 847, everyone knew everyone else's business, or so they thought. The Henderson family had lived there for 3 generations, working the same 400 acres of wheat and barley that Matthew Henderson's grandfather had purchased in 1952. Matthew, 38, ran the farm with the help of his 2 sons, Caleb, 16, and Dylan, 14. Their mother, Rebecca, had died 4 years earlier from cancer, leaving the 3 men to navigate life together in the weathered farmhouse at the end of County Road 17. On the morning of September 19, 2003, Matthew woke to an empty house. The silence felt wrong immediately. His sons' beds were made, unusual for teenage boys, and their jackets were missing from the hooks by the door. Matthew assumed they'd gone out early to check the irrigation lines in the south field, something they occasionally did without telling him. But when noon arrived and they still hadn't returned, a cold dread settled in his stomach. If you're watching this, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything as we share these important stories. Matthew spent the afternoon driving the property in his Ford F-250, calling their names until his voice went hoarse. The wheat stood ready for harvest, golden and still, stretching toward distant mountains already dusted with early snow. By evening, he'd contacted the Whitlock County Sheriff's Department. Deputy Frank Garrett arrived within 20 minutes, his weathered face grave as Matthew explained the situation. "Did they take anything with them? Money, clothes?" Garrett asked, his pen poised over a small notepad. Matthew shook his head. "Their wallets are still in their rooms. So are their phones. Not that they get much signal out here anyway. But Frank, they wouldn't just leave. Caleb's got college applications due. Dylan's got a football game tomorrow night." The search began that night. Within hours, volunteers from Whitlock and neighboring towns converged on the Henderson property. They combed through fields, checked abandoned buildings, and walked the creek beds that crisscrossed the landscape. The local fire department brought in thermal imaging equipment. The state police sent tracking dogs, but the dogs lost the scent at the edge of the property, near where the farm bordered public land, thousands of acres of wilderness stretching into the Big Belt Mountains. Days turned into weeks. The story made national news briefly. 2 teen brothers vanished from Montana farm. Theories proliferated. Some suggested the boys had run away, unable to cope with farm life and their mother's absence. Others whispered about accidents, about the dangerous machinery that littered working farms. The darkest speculation involved foul play, though no one could imagine who would harm the Henderson boys, who were known for their quiet helpfulness and good grades. Matthew refused to stop searching. He took out a second mortgage on the farm to hire a private investigator, a former FBI agent named Leonard Torres, who'd retired to Billings. Torres spent 3 months on the case, interviewing everyone who'd known the boys, examining their school records, tracking their online activity, which was minimal. He found nothing. No evidence of plans to leave, no secret relationships, no hidden troubles. Caleb and Dylan had simply vanished as completely as if they'd never existed. The investigation officially went cold in March 2004. The file remained open, but with no leads and no evidence. There was nowhere for detectives to go. Matthew continued farming, though neighbors noticed how he'd aged. His hair went gray within a year. He stopped attending church, stopped socializing at the feed store. He drove the property obsessively, scanning the fields as if his sons might suddenly reappear among the crops. Years accumulated like dust. The pain never lessened, but Matthew learned to carry it, the way you carry a stone in your pocket, always there, always heavy. He marked every birthday, every anniversary of their disappearance with a private ritual, driving out to the spot where the dogs had lost the scent and sitting in his truck until the sun set behind the mountains. In 2018, 15 years after his sons vanished, Matthew's doctor diagnosed him with prostate cancer. The prognosis was cautiously optimistic, caught early, treatable, but at 53, Matthew felt ancient. He underwent surgery in Great Falls, then radiation treatment through the winter. His sister, Patricia, came from Seattle to stay with him during recovery, horrified at how isolated he'd become. "You can't keep living like this," she told him one evening, looking around the farmhouse that seemed frozen in 2003. The boys' rooms remained untouched, their clothes still hanging in closets. "Matt, they'd want you to live." "How do you know what they'd want?" he replied quietly. "We don't even know if they're alive." But Patricia's visit planted a seed. As Matthew's health improved through 2019 and into 2020, he began to consider practical matters he'd ignored for years. The farm needed modernizing. He was getting older, and if something happened to him, there would be no one to keep searching, no one to remember. In late 2020, Matthew made several changes. He hired a young couple to help run the farm. He updated equipment that had been held together with baling wire and stubbornness. And on the recommendation of his insurance company, he installed a GPS tracking system in his truck, the same 2002 Ford F-250 he'd been driving the day his sons disappeared. The device would help track mileage for tax purposes and provide location data if the truck was stolen. The installation technician, a kid from Missoula named Jake, mounted the small device under the dashboard. "It stores historical data for 7 years, Jake explained, running through the features on a laptop. "You can access it through this portal, see everywhere you've driven, how long you've been at each location. Pretty cool, actually." Matthew nodded absently, more interested in getting back to work than in technology. He barely thought about the device after that, except when reviewing quarterly reports for his accountant. Life continued its slow march. The pandemic years were isolating, even by Montana standards, but Matthew had been isolated long before COVID-19 gave everyone else a taste of loneliness. He kept farming, kept maintaining his son's rooms, kept driving out to that spot at the edge of the property on significant dates. Then came the summer of 2023, 20 years after Caleb and Dylan vanished. Matthew had been having trouble with the truck's electrical system, intermittent starting issues, dashboard lights flickering. He took it to Dawson's Auto Repair in Whitlock, where he'd been bringing vehicles for decades. Old Jim Dawson had retired, but his son Trevor ran the place now, and Trevor had grown up with Caleb, had been on the football team with Dylan. "I'll need to run a full diagnostic," Trevor said, hooking the truck up to a computer system that looked like something from a science fiction movie compared to the tools his father had used. "These older Fords, the wiring can get weird." Matthew left the truck and borrowed Trevor's loaner car. 3 days later, Trevor called him back to the shop. His voice sounded strange on the phone, tight, uncertain. "Matt, you need to come see something. Don't worry, the truck's fine. Just come see this." When Matthew arrived, Trevor led him into the small office at the back of the shop. His laptop sat open on a cluttered desk, displaying a map covered in colored lines, routes traced over satellite imagery. "While I was doing the diagnostic, I accessed your GPS tracker to check for electrical interference," Trevor began, his words careful. "The historical data goes back to when you installed it in 2020. But Matt, there was older data still on the device, from before." Matthew stared at the screen, not understanding. "The tracking system you installed. They use the same mounting bracket and wiring harness that Ford equipped in these trucks from the factory. Turns out your truck had an early fleet tracking system installed when you bought it. Dealers did that sometimes for commercial vehicles. It was inactive, but the memory chip was still in there. When they installed the new system, they overwrote most of it, but there were fragments. Data from 2003. The room felt suddenly airless. Matthew gripped the edge of the desk. Trevor clicked through screens, his hand shaking slightly. It's incomplete. Just a few days' worth from September 2003. But Matt, there are trips on here that aren't. They're not your normal routes. The map zoomed in, focusing on Whitlock County. Red lines traced familiar paths, the farm to town to the grain elevator, standard routes Matthew had driven thousands of times. But there were other lines too, heading north from the farm into the public lands, following old logging roads that barely existed anymore. This one, Trevor pointed to a route dated September 18, 2003, the night before Matthew discovered his sons missing. This leaves your property at 11:47 p.m. Goes 23 miles north, follows Forest Service Road 284 all the way to an old mining area near Copper Ridge, stays there for 47 minutes, then returns. Gets back to your farm at 2:18 a.m. Matthew couldn't breathe. I didn't make that drive. I was home. I went to bed at 10 that night. The two men stared at each other as the implications settled between them like a heavy blanket. Someone else had taken Matthew's truck that night. Someone had driven it deep into the wilderness while he slept, and the next morning, his sons were gone. The Whitlock County Sheriff's Department had changed significantly in 20 years. Deputy Frank Garrett had retired in 2015. The sheriff himself, old Bill McKenzie, had died of a heart attack in 2019. The new sheriff, Angela Chen, was a transplant from Denver, younger, tech-savvy, and initially skeptical when Matthew and Trevor arrived with their story. But the GPS data was undeniable. "This changes everything," Chen said, studying the printouts spread across her desk. She'd called in 2 state police investigators and was already coordinating with the FBI field office in Helena. "This gives us a specific location to search and possibly evidence that someone with access to your home was involved." The search of the Copper Ridge mining area began on August 3, 2023. It was massive. Dozens of law enforcement officers, forensic teams, cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar equipment. The old mining site was a warren of collapsed tunnels and overgrown equipment, reclaimed by pine forest and 50 years of neglect. Massive tailings piles sprawled across the landscape, and vertical shafts dropped into darkness, sealed with rusting iron grates. Matthew insisted on being there, despite Sheriff Chen's reservations. He sat in his truck at the command post they'd established at the entrance to the site, watching teams disappear into the forest and emerge hours later, faces grim with effort and heat. On the second day, the cadaver dogs alerted near one of the old ventilation shafts. The forensic team spent hours carefully excavating the area. The shaft had been partially filled with rocks and debris. Deliberately, the investigators noted, not a natural collapse. Someone had tried to hide something. 26 feet down, they found the remains. The forensic anthropologist worked slowly, documenting everything. 2 bodies, both young males, cause of death appeared to be blunt force trauma to the skulls. Dental records would be needed for positive identification, but the clothing, Levi's jeans, Carhartt jackets, work boots, matched what Matthew remembered his sons wearing. They also found something else in that shaft, a .22 caliber rifle, corroded but still identifiable by its serial number. It had been reported stolen from a farm near Whitlock in 1998. The farm belonged to Carl Brenner, a man Matthew had known his entire life. Carl Brenner had been Matthew's hired hand for 6 years, from 1999 to 2005. He'd worked the farm when Rebecca was sick, had stayed on after she died to help Matthew manage the land and look after the boys. He'd been there the night they disappeared, one of the first people Matthew had called when he couldn't find them. Carl had joined the search, had spent weeks helping look for Caleb and Dylan. He'd attended their memorial service when the family finally held one in 2005. And then he'd moved to Idaho, taken a job at a lumber mill, and Matthew had gradually lost touch with him. Sheriff Chen's team located Carl in Coeur d'Alene, working as a maintenance supervisor at a hotel. He was 67 now, with grandchildren and a quiet life. When detectives arrived to question him, he'd asked for a lawyer immediately. The trial didn't begin until April 2024, slowed by legal proceedings and forensic analysis. The prosecution's case was circumstantial but compelling. Carl had access to the Henderson farm and Matthew's truck keys. He knew the boys' routines. The rifle found in the shaft was linked to him through the theft report. And then there was his financial situation in 2003, debt, a gambling problem Matthew hadn't known about, desperation for money that Matthew didn't have to loan him. The prosecution argued that Carl had tried to rob Matthew, had been confronted by the boys, and had killed them in panic. He'd used Matthew's truck to dispose of the bodies, assuming the vehicle's movements would never be traceable. After all, GPS tracking wasn't common in 2003, especially not on private trucks in rural Montana. But it was the testimony of Carl's ex-wife that sealed his conviction. She'd divorced him in 2007, moved to Oregon. On the witness stand, her voice shaking, she described how Carl had become paranoid and withdrawn after leaving Montana, how he'd had nightmares, would wake up screaming about the boys and the mine, how he'd begged her never to let him go back to Montana, never to ask what happened. "I thought he'd seen something in the war," she testified, tears streaming down her face. "He'd served in Vietnam. I thought it was that, but the way he talked, I should have known. God help me, I should have known." The jury deliberated for 11 hours. They convicted Carl Brenner of 2 counts of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. In the courtroom, Carl had turned to look at Matthew before they led him away. His face was drawn, ancient, full of something that might have been remorse or might have been only exhaustion. "I panicked," he'd said, his voice barely audible. "They walked in on me going through your office, looking for your checkbook. I just panicked, Matt. I'm sorry. I'm so damn sorry." Matthew had said nothing. There was nothing to say. The funeral was held on a brilliant June day in 2024. The Montana sky an endless blue dome above the Whitlock Cemetery. Caleb and Dylan Henderson were finally laid to rest beside their mother, 21 years after they'd vanished from their home. The service was attended by hundreds, former classmates now in their 30s, teachers, neighbors, people who'd searched in 2003, and people who'd only heard the story. Matthew stood between the 2 caskets, one hand on each, and tried to find words. His sister Patricia held his other arm, keeping him steady. "They were good boys," he finally said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "They worked hard. They laughed at terrible jokes. Dylan wanted to be a veterinarian. Caleb was going to study engineering. They had whole lives ahead of them." He paused, looking out at the mountains that had kept their secret for 2 decades. "I used to wonder if not knowing was worse than knowing, spending 20 years searching, hoping, imagining they might be alive somewhere. And now I know the truth, and it's not better, it's just different. But at least I can stop searching. At least I can let them rest." The investigation had revealed other details in the months following Carl's arrest. The forensic accountant discovered that Carl had taken $3,400 from the Henderson farm accounts in early September 2003, forging Matthew's signature on checks. It wasn't the fortune Carl seemed to think he'd need to solve his problems, but it was enough to temporarily satisfy his gambling debts. After killing the boys, he'd covered his tracks, joining the search effort as a way to monitor the investigation and appear innocent. The GPS data that finally solved the case had been a 1-in-a-million technological fluke. The original tracking system installed in Matthew's truck had been a pilot program Ford ran with a tech company in the early 2000s, before GPS became standard. Most of those systems had been deactivated or removed. that Matthews remained dormant in the vehicle for 17 years, storing fragmentary data until a new system accidentally accessed it, was what the prosecutors called an act of providence. Matthew thought about that phrase often in the months after the trial. Providence. As if something divine had guided events to bring his sons home. He didn't know if he believed that. The God he'd grown up believing in seemed very far away from the reality of two teenagers beaten to death and thrown in a mining shaft by a man their father had trusted. But he was grateful for the resolution, even as it hollowed him out in new ways. The farm felt different after everything was over. Matthew walked fields that Caleb and Dylan had walked, touched equipment they'd operated, and felt their absence not as an open wound now, but as a scar. Permanent, visible, part of his landscape forever. His sister Patricia suggested he sell the place, move to Seattle, start over. But Matthew couldn't imagine leaving. This land held 3 generations of his family, including his sons. Their story was rooted here, and so was his. Instead, he made changes. He established a scholarship fund at Whitlock High School in Caleb and Dylan's names, awarded annually to students studying engineering or veterinary medicine. He donated money to the county sheriff's department for updated forensic equipment, and he finally, after 20 years, began sorting through his sons' rooms, not erasing them, but curating them, keeping what mattered and releasing what didn't. In Dylan's desk, he found a letter, unfinished, never sent. It was dated September 15th, 2003, 4 days before the boys disappeared. "Dad," it began in Dylan's messy handwriting, "I know it's been hard since Mom died. I know you miss her. We miss her too. But Caleb and I were thinking maybe next summer we could take a trip, just the 3 of us. Go fishing in Yellowstone like we used to before she got sick. You work too hard. We all work too hard. Mum would want us to be happy, not just surviving. Anyway, think about it. Love, Dylan." Matthew sat on Dylan's bed, holding that letter, and cried for the first time since the funeral. He cried for the trip they never took, for the conversation they never had, for the easy assumption his 14-year-old son had made that there would be a next summer, and many summers after that. When he finished crying, he folded the letter carefully and put it in his wallet, where he'd carry it always. By the fall of 2024, life in Whitlock had resumed its normal rhythms. The Henderson case faded from national news, though locally it remained a touchstone, a story everyone knew, a reminder of how darkness could hide in familiar places. Matthew marked what would have been Caleb's 37th birthday in October with a quiet dinner at the farm. Patricia and her husband flew in from Seattle. Trevor Dawson stopped by with his wife and kids. Sheriff Chen came too, off duty, bringing a bottle of wine and stories about her own family. They ate around the long table in the farmhouse kitchen and talked about everything except what had brought them together. It felt right. Life continuing. Connection persisting despite tragedy. Later, when the others had left, Matthew stood on the porch and looked out at fields silvered by moonlight. Harvest was done. The land rested under an early November frost. In the spring, he'd plant again, continue the cycle his grandfather had started. He thought about the GPS tracker, that small piece of technology that had solved everything. The forensic team had explained it to him in detail, how digital data persisted in unexpected ways, how memory chips could retain fragments even after being overwritten, how the specific combination of old and new systems had created a perfect storm of preservation. "It's like the truck remembered," Trevor had said when they'd first discovered it. "Like it knew you needed to know." Matthew didn't believe trucks could remember or know things, but he believed in evidence, in science, in the patient accumulation of facts that could illuminate even the darkest mysteries, and he believed in carrying on. Inside the house, he opened his laptop and pulled up the foundation website he'd created for the scholarship fund. Already, 3 students had received awards. Their photos smiled out at him, young people with their whole lives ahead, studying and working and becoming who they'd be. It wasn't redemption. His sons were still gone. Carl Brenner still sat in a cell in Montana State Prison, and would until he died. But it was something, a way of transforming loss into purpose, of ensuring that Caleb and Dylan's names meant more than just a tragedy, more than just a cautionary tale about trusting the wrong person. Matthew updated the website with information about the next scholarship cycle, then closed his laptop. Tomorrow he'd drive into town, pick up feed for the cattle, maybe stop at the diner for coffee. Normal things. The things that stitch a life together when the extraordinary recedes. He looked once more at the framed photo on the mantel, himself with Caleb and Dylan at Dylan's 8th grade graduation. All three of them sunburned and grinning, Rebecca behind the camera. It had been taken just 2 months before she died, 4 months before his boys disappeared. A perfect moment, preserved. "I know now," he said quietly to the photo. "I know what happened. I know where you are. You can rest." And maybe, finally, so could he. The story of the Henderson brothers became something of a landmark case in forensic circles. Detective training seminars used it as an example of how overlooked technology could break cold cases. The GPS data recovery technique Trevor's diagnostic equipment had stumbled upon was refined and formalized, turned into a protocol that law enforcement agencies across the country began applying to other unsolved disappearances. In March 2025, Matthew received a letter from the mother of a girl who'd vanished in Oregon in 2005. She'd read about the Henderson case and wanted him to know that investigators had used similar methods to recover data from her daughter's car, leading them to a location where they'd found remains and eventually arrested a suspect. "Your sons helped bring my daughter home," the letter concluded. "I'll never be able to thank them, but I wanted you to know that their story is still helping people, still solving mysteries, still bringing families peace." Matthew kept that letter with Dylan's unfinished note in his wallet. More letters came, a father from Wisconsin, a sister from Alabama, each one representing a family touched by the techniques that had solved his case, each one a reminder that tragedy could spawn unexpected connections, that loss could be transformed, not erased but transformed, into something that mattered beyond itself. In May 2025, Matthew was contacted by a documentary filmmaker interested in telling the story. He agreed, with conditions. The film had to focus on the forensic science, on the possibility of resolution even decades after a crime. It had to honor Caleb and Dylan as people, not just victims, and 20% of any profits had to go to the scholarship fund. The filmmaker agreed, and production began that summer. By then, Matthew was 60 years old. The cancer remained in remission. The farm was thriving under the management of the young couple he'd hired, allowing him more time for other pursuits. He'd started speaking at events about missing persons cases, about the importance of preserving evidence, about never giving up on finding answers. "For 20 years, I searched," he told audiences at law enforcement conferences and victim support groups. "I drove these roads, walked these fields, looked at every face I passed, wondering if they knew something. And the answer was in my truck the whole time, stored in technology I didn't even know existed. It waited 20 years for someone to find it. That's what I want you to remember. Evidence waits. The truth waits. And if we keep searching, keep trying, keep developing better tools and better techniques, we can bring people home." It wasn't the life he'd imagined for himself when he was a young father with 2 sons and a farm to run. But it was a life with purpose, built on the foundation of his loss, constructed from the pieces of his shattered world. On September 19th, 2025, 22 years to the day after Caleb and Dylan disappeared, Matthew Henderson drove out to the cemetery in Whitlock. He did this every year now, on their birthdays and on this anniversary. But this year felt different somehow. Final, in a way the previous memorials hadn't been. The morning was cold, autumn arriving early. He parked near the family plot and walked to the 3 graves, Rebecca, Caleb, Dylan, all in a row beneath a large cottonwood tree that was beginning to turn gold. He'd brought coffee in a thermos and a folding chair, and he sat there for a long time, just being present. Other visitors came and went, tending other graves, but no one disturbed him. In Whitlock, everyone knew Matthew Henderson and what he'd lost. Around noon, Trevor Dawson appeared, walking across the cemetery with his characteristic loping stride. He'd grayed some in the 2 years since he'd discovered the GPS data and had opened a second auto shop in the county seat. He was doing well, but he'd told Matthew once that he still thought about that day almost daily, about the moment he'd understood what he was looking at on that computer screen. "Hey, Matt," Trevor said softly, stopping a respectful distance away. "Mind if I sit a minute?" "Pull up some grass," Matthew replied. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching clouds drift across the Montana sky. Finally, Trevor spoke. "I got a call last week, FBI agent in Texas. They've got a missing person case from 2004, and they want to try the GPS data recovery on the family's vehicles. She asked if I could consult, help them set up the equipment. I said yes, but I wanted to tell you first. Make sure you're okay with it." Matthew nodded slowly. "You solved my case, Trevor. If that can help solve others, that's good. That's important." "I didn't solve it alone," Trevor said. "You never gave up. 20 years, and you never stopped believing you'd find answers." "Some days I wanted to," Matthew admitted. "Some days it would have been easier to just accept that they were gone, and I'd never know why. But I couldn't do that to them, or to Rebecca. She'd have wanted me to keep fighting." They sat a while longer, then Trevor stood, clapping Matthew on the shoulder before heading back to his truck. Matthew remained, finishing his coffee as the afternoon lengthened. He thought about the impossibly fragile chain of circumstances that had led to resolution. If he hadn't gotten sick in 2018, he might not have modernized the farm. If he hadn't installed the GPS tracker in 2020, there would have been no reason for Trevor to access that system in 2023 if the original tracking device had been removed instead of left dormant. If the new system hadn't happened to access those specific memory fragments, if Trevor hadn't thought to look deeper into the data, any one of those breaks in the chain, and Caleb and Dylan would still be unfound, their disappearance still a mystery. Carl Brenner still a free man. Providence, the prosecutors had called it. Luck, the defense attorney had argued. Bad luck for his client. The forensic specialist preferred technological serendipity. Matthew thought of it as simply the truth, waiting to be found. Before leaving the cemetery, he touched each of the 3 headstones, Rebecca first, then Caleb, then Dylan. The stone was cool under his palm, solid and permanent. "I love you," he said quietly. "I'll see you next year." He drove back to the farm as the sun angled toward the mountains. There was work to do. There was always work to do on a farm. But there was also peace now, hard-won and bittersweet, but real. The documentary about the case would premiere in December. The Scholarship Fund would award its 6th round of grants in January, and Matthew Henderson would continue farming the land his grandfather had claimed, growing wheat and barley under the big Montana sky, carrying his loss and his resolution together, one foot in front of the other, one season after another. The truth had waited 20 years to be found. Now, finally, everyone could rest.